10 men, 360 miles of ice. 0 depots ever used. 3 men died, completing a mission that no longer existed. May 6, 1915, McMurdo Sound, Antarctica. On this night, a blizzard descended on Ross Island with the fury of something that had been waiting. Wind screamed across the ice at 60 miles per hour. Snow drove horizontally, erasing the line between ground and sky. Visibility collapsed to nothing. A man could lose his companion at arm's length. Inside Scott's old expedition hut at Cape Evans, 10 men huddled against the cold and waited for morning. They did not know that by dawn, everything they owned would be gone. What no one at Cape Evans realized, what they could not have known, is that the tragedy waiting for them would not be decided by that blizzard. It would be decided by a man who was already 2,000 miles away. Sailing toward the opposite side of the continent, his attention fixed entirely on his own glory. Ernest Shackleton had given these men their orders. He had promised them supplies, equipment, a plan. Then he had boarded his ship, the Endurance, and sailed away toward the Weddell Sea. He never looked back. This is not the story of men who died because Antarctica was cruel. Antarctica is always cruel. That is not a story, that is a weather report. This is the story of men who died because they were loyal to a plan that had already failed, and no one told them. They completed their mission perfectly. They laid every depot exactly where Shackleton wanted it. They did everything right. And it meant nothing. By minute 8, you'll understand why these men were doomed before they ever left the hut. By minute 12, you'll see the decision that killed 3 of them, the moment when loyalty crossed the line into self-destruction. And by the end, you'll know the answer to the question that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Was it worth it? But first, you need to understand what these men were walking into, and what the man who sent them refused to see. By 1914, the great age of Antarctic exploration was ending. The South Pole had been conquered. Roald Amundsen planted the Norwegian flag there in December 1911, efficient, methodical, alive. Robert Falcon Scott arrived 5 weeks later, second place in a 2-man race. He and his 4 companions died on the return journey, their bodies found frozen in their tent 8 months later. The race was over, the prize was claimed, the cost was paid. But one challenge remained. No one had ever crossed the Antarctic continent. 1,700 miles of ice, from the Weddell Sea on one side to the Ross Sea on the other, passing through the South Pole itself. It was the longest possible journey across the most hostile environment on Earth. It was the last great Antarctic first. And in the world of 1914, a world where national prestige was measured in flags planted on empty ice, where glory was calculated in miles traveled and hardships endured that mattered. It mattered enormously. The crossing offered nothing practical. No trade routes would open. No resources would be extracted. No strategic advantage would be gained. The ice held nothing but cold and death and the peculiar satisfaction of being first to walk across it. But the crossing offered something the British Empire valued more than practicality. It offered first. To cross Antarctica was to claim the last unclaimed glory on the polar map. For a nation that had lost the South Pole to Norway and lost Scott in the process, a hero martyred to insufficient planning and British stubbornness, redemption was waiting on the ice. All it would cost was everything. And no one felt that pressure more than Ernest Shackleton. Here's why. Roald Amundsen had proven something uncomfortable in 1911. He had proven that Antarctica could be beaten, not by suffering, but by preparation, not by endurance, but by efficiency. Amundsen treated the polar journey as a logistics problem. He used dogs, teams of them, expertly handled, fed on precisely calculated rations. He wore fur clothing adapted from Inuit designs, clothing that breathed and flexed and kept men alive. He moved fast. He traveled light. He reached the pole and returned with all his men healthy. To the British establishment, this felt like cheating. The British tradition demanded suffering. Man-hauling men in harness, dragging their own sledges through the snow, was not just a method. It was a moral statement. You proved your worth by how much you could endure. The journey was supposed to hurt. Scott had man-hauled to the pole. Scott had died. But the tradition did not die with him. The culture that celebrated suffering, that confused agony with achievement, that measured heroism in pain rather than success, that culture survived. And it would consume the men of the Ross Sea Party. One approach would cross Antarctica, one would fail on the ice. The difference came down to a single question: when does loyalty become lethal? Aeneas McIntosh was a product of that tradition. A merchant navy officer from a respectable family, shaped by duty, hierarchy, and the unquestioning service that the British system demanded of its men. He was not brilliant. He was not innovative. He did not question orders or challenge assumptions. But he was brave, and he was loyal to Shackleton. He had proven that loyalty already. In 1908, during Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, McIntosh was helping to unload cargo at the Antarctic base when a cargo hook swung free of its line. It struck him directly in the face. He lost his right eye. Shackleton felt responsible. Perhaps he was. And when 6 years later, Shackleton needed someone to lead the supply-laying party for his Trans-Antarctic crossing, the team that would work from the Ross Sea side, placing depots of food and fuel for Shackleton to collect on his journey, he chose McIntosh. It was a gift born of guilt. It would become a death sentence. In January 1914, Ernest Shackleton announced his Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition to the world. The plan was audacious. Shackleton himself would lead a party of 6 men from the Weddell Sea coast. They would cross the polar plateau, pass through the South Pole, descend the Beardmore Glacier, and emerge on the Ross Ice Shelf, 1,700 miles of uncharted ice and crevasse and wind. But there was a problem. They could not carry enough supplies for the entire journey. Halfway across the continent, Shackleton's party would begin to starve, unless someone had been there first. That's where the Ross Sea Party came in. While Shackleton crossed from one side of Antarctica, a second team would work from the other. They would sail to McMurdo Sound, establish a base on Ross Island, and lay supply depots across the ice shelf, caches of food, fuel, and equipment stretching south toward the Beardmore Glacier. When Shackleton descended from the plateau, exhausted and starving, those depots would save his life. Without them, he would die on the ice. If the Ross Sea Party failed, the entire expedition failed. But Shackleton would spend almost no time thinking about them. He had his own journey to plan, his own ship to sail, his own glory to chase. The men who would place the depots, the men whose work would mean the difference between Shackleton's life and death, were an afterthought. Shackleton did not announce his plans quietly. He announced them to the Empire. Funding came from the British government, £10,000, from wealthy donors whose names would adorn the expedition's equipment and reports, from public subscriptions, ordinary citizens contributing shillings to the cause. But funding was never sufficient. Every expedition of this era scraped and borrowed and begged, and what money there was went primarily to Shackleton's own Weddell Sea Party. The Endurance was well equipped. The Endurance carried the best men, the best supplies, the personal attention of the expedition's leader. The Ross Sea Party received what was left. They were a support mission, and you don't spend your best resources on support. With public funding came public expectation. This was not a private adventure. It was a national mission. Committees were involved. The Royal Geographical Society was watching. The press would report on every success and every failure. Failure would be public, permanent, devastating. That pressure shaped everything that followed. It shaped the decision to sail with incomplete supplies. It shaped the decision to rush the first season's depot laying. And it shaped the decision to keep moving forward, keep pushing south, keep obeying orders, even when every rational signal demanded retreat. Mackintosh could not question Shackleton's orders. Shackleton was the most famous explorer in Britain. Shackleton had given him command. Shackleton trusted him to complete the mission. And Mackintosh would complete the mission. Even if it killed him. It would. The Ross Sea party was equipped with a compromise. A motor tractor, modern, untested, theoretically capable, would haul supplies from ship to depot across the smooth surface of the ice shelf. Dogs would assist, though there were too few and most were in poor condition. And when all else failed, when the machines broke down and the dogs gave out, the men would do what British explorers had always done. They would haul the sledges themselves. It was a plan that required everything to work perfectly. Multiple methods, multiple failure points, multiple opportunities for one breakdown to cascade into the next. Antarctica does not reward complexity. Antarctica punishes it. But Shackleton was not there to see the fragility. By the time the Ross Sea party departed, Shackleton was already at sea aboard the Endurance, sailing toward the Weddell Sea and the glory that awaited him there. He would never look back. The expedition was ready. The men believed they were prepared. In less than 6 months, a single night would erase everything they had brought with them, their ship, their supplies, their way home. But for now, hope remained intact. The ship was sailing, the ice was waiting. And Shackleton was already gone. On December 24, 1914, Christmas Eve, the SY Aurora departed Hobart, Tasmania, and sailed south toward Antarctica. The wharves were quiet. The Great War had begun 4 months earlier, and it had already emptied the docks of young men. There were no crowds cheering, no brass bands, no fluttering handkerchiefs from families who might never see their sons again. Just a small, battered ship carrying 25 men into the most isolated place on Earth. From the beginning, the journey tested them. The Aurora was old. She had served Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition 2 years earlier, and she bore the scars. Her hull had been patched but not properly refitted. Her timbers groaned in heavy seas. She was not the ship Shackleton had promised them. And she was not carrying the supplies Shackleton had promised either. Mackintosh had sent urgent cables to London in the weeks before departure. Equipment was missing. Clothing was inadequate. Essential items had failed to materialize. The replies from London were vague. Shackleton was already at sea. His attention was elsewhere. Mackintosh sailed anyway. None of this was fatal yet, but it was cumulative. Each missing item, each compromise, each shortfall added to the weight the expedition would carry. And Antarctica does not forgive accumulation. In January 1915, Ross Island appeared through the fog. Mount Erebus rose from the ice, a volcanic cone trailing steam against the pale sky, 12,000 feet of rock and fire surrounded by frozen sea. The Ross ice shelf stretched south to the horizon, flat and featureless and infinite. The scale of it was difficult to comprehend. You could fit countries on that ice. You could lose armies. Mackintosh chose Cape Evans as his base, the same site where Scott's Terra Nova expedition had built their hut 4 years earlier. The hut still stood, a small wooden rectangle against the white vastness, and it was still stocked with supplies from that doomed expedition. Tins of food, fuel, equipment, the detritus of men who had not come home. It was a fortunate inheritance. The Ross Sea party did not know it yet, but those cached supplies would save their lives. But the Aurora was meant to be their lifeline, their shelter, their supply depot, their only way home. Before any attempt on the main depot route, the first season's work had to be completed. What happened in those months would determine everything that followed. Through January and February 1915, sledging parties set out across the ice shelf. Their task was to lay depots, caches of food and fuel, south toward the Beardmore Glacier, marking the route Shackleton would follow on his crossing. Each depot would bring Shackleton closer to survival. Each flag planted in the snow would be a beacon guiding him home. Progress was slow. The motor tractor failed almost immediately. It overheated. It broke down. It sank into soft snow and could not be extracted. Within weeks, it was abandoned, an expensive monument to untested technology, half buried in the white. The dogs were too few and too poorly fed to compensate. They hauled what they could, but what they could was not enough. The men hauled the rest. By late March, depots had been established to approximately 80 degrees south, roughly 140 miles from base. The men returned exhausted, frostbitten, some already showing the first signs of deterioration that would become impossible to ignore. But they were alive, and being alive often masked deeper problems. The Aurora was moored at Cape Evans for the winter, anchored against the sea ice that was forming around her hull. The assumption was simple: the ship would be there in spring. The ship would always be there. Everyone assumed it. They assumed wrong. By late autumn 1915, the Ross Sea party stood at a crossroads. The first season was complete. Depots were laid to 80 degrees south. The ship was secure. Winter was closing in, months of darkness, months of waiting, months of planning for the push to come. In 6 months, when the sun returned, they would push south to finish the job. They would lay supplies all the way to Mount Hope, at the base of the Beardmore Glacier, 360 miles from base. Everything still seemed possible. That illusion had 12 hours left to live. May 6, 1915. The night that changed everything. A blizzard struck McMurdo Sound without warning. Not the slow gathering of clouds that gives men time to prepare, but a sudden violence, wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, temperatures plummeting, the world outside the hut reduced to a howling white void. Inside Scott's hut at Cape Evans, 10 members of the shore party waited out the storm. They had weathered blizzards before. They would weather this one. In the morning, they would dig out the drifts and continue their work. The Aurora was moored nearby, secured against the sea ice with anchors and cables. She had ridden out storms before. She would ride out this one. By morning, the ship was gone. The sea ice had broken up in the night, violently, catastrophically, without warning. The Aurora, still loaded with most of the expedition's supplies, was torn from her moorings and carried out to sea by wind and current. Some of the ship's crew were still aboard when it happened. They woke to find themselves drifting helplessly in the darkness, the shore already invisible, the ice groaning and shifting beneath them. On land, 10 men stood on the frozen edge of the continent and watched the space where their ship had been. Clothing gone. Food gone. Fuel gone. Sledging equipment, sleeping bags, scientific instruments, medical supplies, all of it aboard the Aurora, all of it now drifting somewhere in the Ross Sea. They had the clothes on their backs. They had whatever remained cached in Scott's old hut, supplies left behind by dead men 4 years earlier. They had each other. And they had the knowledge that no one in the world knew they needed rescue. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. Ernest Joyce, the most experienced Antarctic hand among them, wrote in his diary that night. His words were simple. "I cannot describe the awful feeling of helplessness and impotence occasioned by the absence of our ship. Helplessness, impotence. 2,000 miles from civilization, no communication, no transport, no way home. The ship was gone. But this was not the fatal mistake. The fatal mistake was still ahead, waiting in the mind of a man who could not imagine abandoning his orders. What followed was an act of desperate creativity. The 10 stranded men had to survive an Antarctic winter with almost nothing. 24-hour darkness, temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero, blizzards that could last for days, pinning them inside the hut while the cold crept through every crack in the walls. They scavenged. Scott's hut at Cape Evans contained supplies from the Terra Nova expedition, tins of food, fuel caches, equipment that dead men no longer needed. The older Discovery hut at Hut Point, 13 miles away across the sea ice, held more. Caches from Shackleton's own Nimrod expedition, now 7 years old, were scattered across the landscape. They pieced together a survival system from the scraps of 4 expeditions. They sewed clothing from old tent canvas and flour sacks, stitching crude garments that would have to serve where proper polar gear had been lost. They repaired broken sledging equipment with whatever materials they could find. They hunted seals for food, for fuel, and unknowingly, for the vitamin C that would keep scurvy at bay. Through the endless winter darkness, they worked. Not to wait for rescue. To complete the mission. Because McIntosh had decided, had never stopped deciding, had never considered any alternative, that the depots would be laid. Shackleton might be crossing the continent at this very moment. Shackleton might be descending the Beardmore Glacier, starving, desperate, counting on the supplies that McIntosh had promised to place. McIntosh could not know. He had no way to communicate with the other side of the continent. He had no confirmation that the crossing was happening or that it had even begun. But he could not take the risk. If even one chance existed that Shackleton was coming, the depots had to be there. There was another option. After May 6, 1915, every rational justification existed to scale back the mission. They had no ship, no supplies, no confirmation that anyone was coming. The depots already laid to 80 degrees south might be enough if Shackleton came at all. The responsible decision was clear: preserve their strength, wait for rescue, survive. Ernest Joyce understood this. He had been on Scott's Discovery expedition in 1901. He had been on Shackleton's Nimrod expedition in 1907. He knew what Antarctica demanded, and he knew what it took from men who demanded too much in return. Joyce argued for caution. Joyce argued for limiting the southern journey. Joyce understood that their bodies were now their only resource, and that resource was not infinite. But Joyce was not in command. McIntosh was. And McIntosh could not separate his duty from his identity. Shackleton had said lay depots to Mount Hope. McIntosh would lay depots to Mount Hope. The question of whether this was wise, whether this was even sane, never arose. Only the question of how. On September 1, 1915, the second depot-laying season began. The sun had returned to the Antarctic sky after months of darkness. The sea ice was solid. The route south was open. McIntosh led his parties out from Hut Point toward Mount Hope, 83 degrees 30 minutes south, at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. At first, conditions seemed manageable. The weather held, the surface was firm, the miles passed beneath their feet. But inefficiencies became visible almost immediately. The men were man-hauling, dragging sledges loaded with 200 pounds or more per man, leaning into canvas harnesses, their boots crunching through the crystalline snow. Temperatures hovered around 30 degrees below zero. Their breath froze on their balaclavas. Their sweat froze inside their clothing, forming a layer of ice against their skin. Their clothing was improvised canvas, not the fur and wool that proper polar expeditions carried. It did not breathe. It did not insulate. It cracked and tore in the cold. Their sleeping bags were degraded, the fabric worn thin by use and age. And their rations were wrong. They carried approximately 4,500 calories per day per man. It sounds like a lot. It was not. Man-hauling in extreme cold burned 6,000 to 7,000 calories daily. The mathematics were simple and brutal, a deficit of 2,000 calories per day per man. That deficit cannot be recovered in the field. There is no catching up. Every day, the gap between what they burned and what they ate grew wider. Every day, their bodies consumed their own muscle tissue to keep moving. Every day, they grew weaker. And without fresh food, without the vitamin C found in seal meat and fresh vegetables, scurvy began its silent work. No single mistake defined this phase of the journey. Instead, it was accumulation. The rations were slightly insufficient. The clothing was slightly inadequate. The pace was slightly too fast. The rest periods were slightly too short. None of these decisions seemed dangerous in isolation. Together, they narrowed the margin of survival to nothing. Through October, November, December, the parties pushed south. Depot after depot was laid. At 79 degrees south, a cache of food and fuel. At 80 degrees, another, 81, 82, 83. Each depot was placed at the exact coordinates Shackleton had specified. Each was stocked with the exact supplies he had requested. The work was meticulous, professional, perfect. And with each depot laid, the men moved farther from safety and closer to collapse. The Reverend Arnold Spencer Smith, the expedition's chaplain and photographer, began showing unmistakable symptoms in late November. His legs swelled. His skin darkened with subcutaneous bleeding. His gums bled, his teeth loosened. His joints ached with a deep, grinding pain that no rest could ease. Scurvy, the disease of sailors and explorers, the curse of men who lived on preserved food without fresh vegetables or meat. Vitamin C deficiency causing the body to literally fall apart, blood vessels weakening, connective tissue breaking down, old wounds reopening. Spencer Smith said nothing. He kept marching. He kept photographing. He kept writing in his diary, though the entries grew shorter as the weeks passed. A man of faith, enduring without complaint. A man dying on his feet. On January 6, 1916, Spencer Smith collapsed. He could no longer walk. He could no longer stand. His legs would not support his weight. His body had reached the end of what it could give. McIntosh faced a choice. They were still 40 miles from Mount Hope, the final depot, the last cache that Shackleton would need to survive, had not yet been laid. Behind them, 320 miles of ice separated them from safety at Hut Point. McIntosh could turn back. He could abandon the final depot, accept that they had done enough, preserve the strength of the remaining men, and maximize their chances of survival. Or he could put Spencer Smith on a sledge and keep going. McIntosh did not hesitate. The mission came first. Spencer Smith was lashed to a sledge. 170 pounds of dying man added to loads already crushing the men who carried them. Men who were themselves showing early signs of scurvy. Men whose bodies were already operating on deficit. They would haul Spencer Smith to Mount Hope. Then they would haul him back. The mathematics of survival had already turned against them. 6 men hauling supplies for a crossing party that might never come. 1 man dying on a sledge. 0 confirmation that any of it mattered. The loyalty was perfect. The logic was gone. On January 26, 1916, they reached Mount Hope. The final depot was laid at 83 degrees 30 minutes south, at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Food, fuel, supplies, everything Shackleton would need to complete his crossing, stacked neatly on the ice and marked with flags visible for miles. The mission was complete. Every single depot that Shackleton had requested was now in place. 2,000 miles away, Shackleton's endurance had been crushed by pack ice 2 months earlier. The ship was gone. The crossing was abandoned. Shackleton and his men were drifting on an ice floe in the Weddell Sea, fighting for their own survival. He was never coming. But the men at Mount Hope did not know that. They could not know. They only knew the job was done. Now they had to get home. If you've made it this far, you understand something most accounts of this expedition miss. These men were not destroyed by Antarctica. They were not destroyed by bad luck or bad weather or the indifferent cruelty of nature. They were destroyed by loyalty to a mission that had already failed, for a leader who was not coming, in service of a plan that existed only in their commander's mind. What happens next is the part that stays with people. The depot was laid, the return began, and the ice was waiting. On January 27, 1916, the party turned north. Behind them, the depot at Mount Hope sat in perfect stillness, flags snapping in the wind, supplies stacked and secured, a monument to completed duty. Ahead of them lay 360 miles of ice, and at the end of it, if they could reach it, survival. The sledge was heavier now. Not with supplies, those had been left at the depot, cached for a man who would never collect them. Heavier with Spencer-Smith. They hauled him north across the ice shelf, the same terrain they had crossed coming south, but different now. Every landmark was a reminder of how far they still had to go. Every mile covered revealed another mile waiting. Spencer-Smith lay on the sledge, wrapped in sleeping bags and canvas, his body failing in ways the others could see but could not stop. His legs were black with subcutaneous bleeding. His breathing was shallow. His eyes, when he opened them, held the knowledge of what was happening. He made no complaint. The others hauled. Joyce took effective command of the marching column, making the decisions that McIntosh was increasingly unable to make. How far to push each day, when to rest, how to ration the dwindling food. Then McIntosh collapsed. His legs gave out. Scurvy had found him too, the same disease that was killing Spencer-Smith, advancing through his body, weakening his blood vessels, swelling his joints. He could barely walk. Now they had 2 men to support. The mathematics were brutal. 5 men, already exhausted, already malnourished, already operating on deficit, hauling 2 invalids across 300 miles of ice. They kept going. There was no alternative. February ground on. Blizzards pinned them in their tents for days at a time. The wind screamed outside the canvas, and they lay in their sleeping bags, conserving energy they did not have, eating rations that could not sustain them, waiting for weather that might never break. When they could move, progress was agonizing. 5 miles a day, 4-3. The men who could still walk leaned into their harnesses and pulled. The sledge runners scraped across the snow with a sound like tearing cloth. Behind them, the tracks they left filled with drifting snow almost as fast as they made them. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, faces blistered and peeled. The cold was not a temperature but a presence, something that pressed against them, that found every gap in their clothing, that stole heat from their bodies faster than they could generate it. Spencer-Smith's condition worsened daily. He could no longer sit up. He could no longer feed himself. His diary entries, once careful observations of weather and progress, stopped entirely. There were no more words. Only silence. Only the sound of the sledge runners on the snow, and the wind, and the labored breathing of men who were hauling their friend toward a safety he would never reach. By early March, they were close. Hut Point, the old Discovery hut where they could find shelter and seal meat, lay just 20 miles ahead. The dark shape of Observation Hill was visible on the horizon. Safety was not abstract anymore. It was real. It was there. 20 miles. In good conditions, 2 days of travel, perhaps less. But conditions were not good, and their bodies were no longer bodies in any meaningful sense. They were machines running on fumes, systems failing in sequence, held together by nothing but will. Spencer-Smith had not spoken in days. His pulse was weak and irregular. His breathing was shallow. The scurvy had advanced beyond any possibility of recovery in the field. His organs were failing, his blood vessels leaking, his body consuming itself from the inside. The men hauled him anyway. On March 8, 1916, with Hut Point visible on the horizon close enough to see, too far to reach before darkness, they made camp one final time. Spencer Smith was carried into the tent. He was still alive. His companions settled around him, too exhausted to speak, too worn to do anything but wait for morning. The wind picked up outside. In the morning, everything would change. On March 9, 1916, at 3:40 in the morning, the Reverend Arnold Spencer Smith died. He was 32 years old. He had been hauled on a sledge for approximately 40 days, 170 pounds of dying man, dragged across the ice by companions who were themselves barely alive, adding weight that they could not afford to carry, burning calories they could not spare, slowing a journey that could not afford to slow. They had carried him anyway. He made no complaint. In all those days, across all those miles, he asked for nothing. He apologized for the burden he had become. He thanked them for not leaving him behind. And then he stopped. Quietly, without drama, the way men die when their bodies have given everything and there is simply nothing left. Joyce recorded the death in his diary. His words were spare. Spencer Smith passed away at 3:40 a.m. quietly. We buried him in his bag at 9 a.m. That was all. There was nothing more to say. After 40 days of hauling a dying man, after watching him diminish mile by mile, there were no words adequate to the moment. They dug a shallow grave in the snow. The frozen surface resisted their shovels, and they were too weak to dig deep. They lowered him into the ice, said what prayers exhausted men could manage, and marked the spot with a cross made of sledge runners lashed together. Then they moved on. Hut Point was 20 miles away. McIntosh and Hayward could barely walk. The living needed everything the survivors had left. Spencer Smith stayed behind, alone on the ice, under a cross that the wind would bury and unbury for 100 years. He is still there. The survivors reached Hut Point on March 11, 1916. They had crossed 360 miles of ice. They had laid every depot Shackleton had requested. They had buried one man and carried 2 others. They had completed the mission. Inside the old Discovery hut, cramped, cold, but shelter nonetheless, they found what they needed: seal carcasses cached by earlier expeditions, fuel for the stove, walls that kept out the wind. They ate seal meat, and unknowingly they consumed the vitamin C their bodies had been starving for. Slowly, imperceptibly, the scurvy began to retreat. McIntosh's legs strengthened. The swelling in Hayward's joints subsided. Color returned to faces that had been gray with exhaustion. They were going to survive. But they could not reach Cape Evans. 13 miles of sea ice separated Hut Point from the main base, 13 miles that should have been a simple journey. But the ice was thin and unstable. Open water showed through cracks in the surface. The ice flexed underfoot like something alive. They would have to wait. Joyce estimated late May or June, when the winter cold would freeze the sea ice solid. McIntosh accepted this. Then he stopped accepting it. For McIntosh, waiting was intolerable. He had been trapped at Hut Point for weeks. The hut was small and dark and smelled of seal blubber. Cape Evans was better, larger, warmer, stocked with supplies, home to the other members of the party who had stayed behind. It was only 13 miles. He had crossed 360 miles of ice. Surely he could manage 13 more. Ernest Joyce told him the ice was not safe. The surface was too thin. Cracks were visible. A blizzard was building to the south. He could feel it in the pressure, in the way the wind shifted. Joyce had been right about everything so far. Joyce understood the ice. McIntosh did not listen. Victor Hayward, still weak from scurvy, still recovering from the depot journey, said he would go wherever his commander went. Loyalty to the end. On the morning of May 8, 1916, McIntosh made his decision. He would cross. Joyce watched them walk out onto the ice, two figures growing smaller against the white. He watched until they disappeared into the haze, swallowed by the distance. He never saw them again. Spencer Smith died on the ice, 40 days on a sledge, his body destroyed by scurvy. McIntosh and Hayward walked onto thin ice, against the advice of every man who understood the conditions. The mission had been completed, every depot was laid, every order was followed. What happened next was not Antarctica's doing. It was the final cost of loyalty without limits. Sometime on May 8, 1916, a blizzard struck McMurdo Sound. Visibility dropped to zero. Wind scoured the ice. Snow drove horizontally, erasing all landmarks, all direction, all sense of where the world ended and the sky began. Somewhere on the 13 miles between Hut Point and Cape Evans, Aeneas McIntosh and Victor Hayward vanished. The ice may have broken beneath them. The sea beneath the frozen surface is dark and cold and deep, and it does not return what it takes. They may have stepped onto a thin section, felt it give way beneath their boots, and gone through before they could react. Or they may have become disoriented in the whiteout, lost all sense of direction, walked in circles until exhaustion took them, walked into open water they could not see until it was beneath their feet. Or they may have made it almost all the way, almost to safety, almost to Cape Evans before the ice betrayed them. No one knows. Their bodies were never recovered. McIntosh was 36 years old. He had lost his right eye serving Shackleton in 1908. He had spent nearly 2 years stranded in Antarctica serving Shackleton's plan. He had completed every depot, followed every order, maintained his loyalty until the ice itself took him. Hayward was 28. He had survived one of the most brutal sledging journeys in Antarctic history. He had been hauled on a sledge when his own scurvy became too severe to walk. He had recovered, slowly, painfully, at Hut Point. And then he had followed his commander onto the ice. Because that was what loyalty demanded. Joyce recorded their departure in his diary. Then he recorded the blizzard. Then he recorded their failure to arrive at Cape Evans. Then silence. There was nothing more to write. 7 men were left. They gathered at Cape Evans when the ice finally froze solid, Joyce crossing the same route that had killed McIntosh and Hayward weeks later, when the conditions he had warned about had finally passed. 7 men in Scott's old hut, surrounded by the relics of an expedition that had ended in death 4 years earlier. Photographs of dead men on the walls, bunks where dead men had slept, a table where dead men had eaten their final meals. They did not know what had happened to Shackleton. They did not know if rescue would ever come. They did not know if anyone in the world was aware they were still alive. They waited. Another Antarctic winter closed around them. The sun sank below the horizon and did not return. The temperature dropped. The darkness was absolute. They hunted seals. They maintained routines. They kept the stove burning and the hut warm and themselves sane. And they waited. The waiting was its own kind of death, slower, quieter, but just as real. Days measured by meals and chores. Weeks measured by the changing weather. Months measured by nothing at all. Then, in January 1917, a ship appeared on the horizon. The Aurora had survived. When the blizzard tore her from her moorings in May 1915, 10 crew members had still been aboard. Under First Officer Joseph Stenhouse, they had drifted in the pack ice for nearly 10 months. The ship damaged, her rudder gone, supplies dwindling. No way to return to the men they had left behind. Stenhouse held the ship together through sheer will. He rationed food. He made repairs with whatever materials he could find. He kept his crew alive through an Antarctic winter adrift in the ice. In February 1916, the ice finally released them. Stenhouse nursed the battered vessel to New Zealand, and the world learned that the Ross Sea Party was stranded. Shackleton himself, having survived his own impossible journey in the Weddell Sea, took command of the relief expedition. The Aurora was repaired. Supplies were loaded. In December 1916, she sailed south again. On January 10, 1917, the ship reached Cape Evans. The 7 survivors walked out of the hut to meet her. They had been stranded for 20 months. 3 of their companions were dead. And the depots they had laid, every single one of them, placed at the exact coordinates, stocked with the exact supplies, marked with flags visible for miles, had never been used. Shackleton was not crossing Antarctica. He had never crossed. The Endurance had been crushed before the Ross Sea Party even began their fatal second season. Every depot sat untouched on the ice. Every sacrifice had been for nothing. Before they left, the survivors climbed Winvan Hill above Cape Evans. They carried materials for a cross: wood, nails, simple tools. On the summit, with the ice shelf stretching south to the horizon, they erected a memorial. 3 names were inscribed: Arnold Patrick Spencer-Smith, Aeneas Lionel Acton McIntosh, Victor George Hayward. Simple, spare, exposed to the wind that never stops blowing. No speeches were recorded, no ceremony described. Perhaps there were prayers, perhaps there was only silence. They had done what they came to do. They had honored the dead the only way they could. Then they walked back down the hill, boarded the Aurora, and sailed away. The cross still stands. The wind still blows around it. The names still face south, toward the ice where 3 men gave everything for a mission that meant nothing. The Ross Sea Party had done everything Shackleton asked. They had crossed the ice. They had laid the depots. They had followed orders when following orders stopped making sense. They had completed the mission perfectly, faithfully, at the cost of 3 lives. And the tragedy was not that they failed. The tragedy was that they succeeded. Every depot was placed exactly where Shackleton needed it. Every cache was stocked with exactly what he had requested. The work was flawless. And it meant nothing. The crossing never happened. The depots were never collected. The supplies sat on the ice, untouched, until the snow buried them and time erased any trace that they had ever existed. 3 men died for caches that no one would ever open. 3 men died proving their loyalty to a leader who was not there. 3 men died completing a mission that had already failed. The ice accepted their sacrifice the way it accepts everything. With silence, with indifference, with the absolute certainty that it will still be there, unchanged, when everyone who remembers them is gone. When the Aurora limped into Port Chalmers, New Zealand, in February 1916, the world learned that 10 men were stranded on Ross Island. But the world was not listening. The Great War had consumed everything. The Battle of Verdun was grinding through its first weeks, a meat grinder that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives before it ended. The Somme was coming. Europe was bleeding itself dry in the trenches. A handful of men trapped on the ice at the bottom of the world barely registered. A paragraph in the back pages. A brief mention between casualty lists and war dispatches. Shackleton himself was still missing, drifting somewhere in the Weddell Sea, his fate unknown, his endurance crushed and sunk months earlier. No one knew if he was alive. No one was coming to rescue the Ross Sea Party. Not yet. Not for a long time. Shackleton reached civilization in August 1916. His journey from the ice to safety would become the most celebrated survival story of the age. The Endurance crushed, months drifting on ice floes, the desperate voyage to Elephant Island, the 800-mile crossing of the Southern Ocean in a 22-foot boat, the impossible traverse of South Georgia Island's unmapped mountains. He had done the impossible. He had brought all 28 men of his WedLC party home alive. That story would make him immortal. But even as he organized the rescue of his own men from Elephant Island, Shackleton learned that another group was still waiting. The men he had sent to the Ross Sea. The men he had equipped with a failing ship and incomplete supplies. The men he had given orders to and then forgotten. They were still alive, some of them at least. They needed rescue. It took 5 more months to repair the Aurora and mount a relief expedition. 5 more months of uncertainty for the 7 survivors at Cape Evans. 5 more months of not knowing if the ship on the horizon would ever appear. When it finally did, 20 months had passed since the blizzard that changed everything. 20 months of isolation. 20 months of waiting. 20 months of wondering if they had been forgotten entirely. When the Aurora reached Cape Evans in January 1917, the survivors were ready. They had prepared for this moment, or tried to. Inside the hut, they had gathered everything that mattered: journals, diaries, meteorological logs kept through 2 winters of darkness, scientific observations recorded with the discipline of men who had nothing left but routine. Spencer Smith's photographs, Mackintosh's papers, the evidence of what they had done and what they had endured. The rescuers read the journals in silence. The pages told the story plainly: the ship torn away by the blizzard, the desperate improvisation through the first winter, the decision to continue the depoling despite everything, Spencer Smith collapsing on the ice, Mackintosh and Hayward walking into the blizzard. Nothing needed to be explained. The facts spoke for themselves. And the rescuers understood what the journals made clear: no one would be held accountable for any of it. Richard Richards, the youngest member of the shore party, would live until 1985, the last surviving witness, carrying the memory for 7 decades. Late in his life, looking back across all those years, he offered his own summary of what had happened. It was a tragic story of the most tragic kind. The most tragic kind. Because the tragedy was not that they had failed. The tragedy was that they had succeeded at something that did not matter. The memorial cross on Winvane Hill was the last thing they built before they left. 3 names, simple wood, hand-carved letters weathered by the wind before the rescuers had even departed. No record survives of what was said at the summit. No speeches, no eulogies. Perhaps there were prayers. Spencer Smith had been the expedition's chaplain after all, and the men who survived him were not strangers to faith. Perhaps there was only silence. The appropriate response to certain kinds of loss is not words. It is simply standing in the presence of what has happened, acknowledging it, and then walking away. The Aurora sailed on February 9, 1917. The 7 survivors reached New Zealand and stepped back into a world consumed by war, a world that had barely noticed their absence and would barely register their return. Their story was immediately overshadowed by Shackleton's endurance saga, which he promoted vigorously through lectures and books and photographs. The Ross Sea party became a footnote. Most of the survivors served in the war. Some were wounded, some were decorated, none became famous. Ernest Joyce was awarded the Albert Medal for his role in saving the sledging party, Britain's highest civilian honor for bravery, but he remained bitter for the rest of his life. He had warned Mackintosh about the ice. He had been right, and being right had saved no one. Richard Richards lived quietly for 70 more years. When asked about the expedition, his answers were simple and spare. "We just did what we had to do." The simplest statement. The heaviest weight. They did what they had to do. And no one needed them to do it. There was no inquiry into the Ross Sea party deaths. No formal investigation. No public accounting of what had gone wrong or who bore responsibility. The war consumed all available attention, all available outrage. 3 men dead on the ice at the bottom of the world. It was a tragedy, certainly, but it was a small tragedy in an age of mass slaughter. Shackleton faced no public consequences. Some private criticism found its way to him. Letters from families, questions from expedition members who understood what had happened, murmurs in the geographic societies about planning and preparation, and the men who had been left behind. But Shackleton had brought his own men home, all 28 of them alive. That story was too powerful, too heroic, too necessary in a world drowning in death. The men he had saved made him immortal. The men he had abandoned were forgotten. When the full story emerged, through journals published years later, through memoirs written in old age, through historians piecing together what had happened, the reaction was not outrage. It was something quieter, a recognition that there was no villain to blame. Shackleton had not intended to abandon the Ross Sea Party. The Endurance had been crushed by ice beyond his control. He could not have rescued them even if he had wanted to. Mackintosh had not intended to kill Spencer Smith. He had been following orders, completing a mission, doing his duty as he understood it. His loyalty was not malice. It was something worse. It was the inability to imagine any other way of being. The Aurora had not meant to be blown away. The blizzard was not a punishment. The ice was not hostile. The universe was not conspiring against them. Every decision was reasonable in isolation. Every choice was defensible. And together, they formed a chain that dragged 3 men into the ice and left them there. The story was not about evil. It was about systems. About cultures that valued duty over judgment. About hierarchies that demanded obedience over adaptation. About leaders who gave orders and then sailed away. About men who followed those orders because following orders was all they knew how to do. The Ross Sea Party was destroyed by loyalty. And loyalty is not supposed to be the thing that kills you. There was no single moment when the Ross Sea tragedy became inevitable. Only a chain of choices, each one reasonable, each one defensible, each one leading to the next. Shackleton underfunded the expedition because his attention was elsewhere. Mackintosh was appointed because of guilt rather than competence. The Aurora was not unloaded because everyone assumed she would stay. The mission continued after the ship was lost because Mackintosh could not imagine abandoning it. Spencer Smith was hauled on the sledge because leaving him behind was unthinkable. Mackintosh walked onto the thin ice because waiting was intolerable. Step by step, choice by choice, loyalty by loyalty. Until 3 men were dead and 6 depots sat untouched on the ice. Antarctica did not change because of what happened. The ice shelf still stretches south to the horizon, flat and featureless and infinite. The wind still blows across the barrier, carrying snow in horizontal sheets. The cold still waits for anyone foolish enough to challenge it. It remains what it has always been. Silent, indifferent, unmoved. The expedition did not end with rescue. It ended with a cross on a hill, facing south toward the ice where 3 men gave everything they had. It ended with journals that recorded everything and changed nothing. It ended with the quiet understanding that duty without judgment is not heroism. It is destruction. The men of the Ross Sea Party did not fail to try. Their effort was extraordinary. Their endurance was remarkable. Their loyalty was absolute. But they failed to question. They failed to ask the one question that could have saved 3 lives. What if Shackleton isn't coming? And Antarctica does not answer questions. It only collects the bodies of those who forgot to ask them. The depots are gone now, buried under decades of snow, erased by time and weather and the slow, patient work of a continent that does not care what men build on its surface. But the cross still stands, and the wind still blows, and the ice does not remember their names. Thank you for staying until the end. This story does not offer easy answers. It does not have a villain you can blame or a hero you can celebrate without reservation. It has only men who did their best, made their choices, and paid the price. But I have a question for you. If you were Macintosh after the Aurora blew away, no ship, no supplies, no communication with the outside world, would you have continued laying depots for Shackleton? Would you have pushed south to Mount Hope, knowing that you had no confirmation the crossing was even happening? Or would you have prioritized your men's survival and waited for rescue? Was Macintosh's loyalty heroic, the devotion of a man who refused to abandon his duty even in impossible circumstances? Or was it reckless, the stubbornness of a man who could not adapt, could not question, could not imagine any path other than the one he had been ordered to walk? I don't have the answer. I'm not sure there is one. But I'd like to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, next week I'm covering another expedition where a leader abandoned his men on the ice. But this time it wasn't an accident. The Karluk disaster of 1913. Vilhjalmur Stefansson was leading a Canadian Arctic expedition when his ship became trapped in the ice north of Alaska. Instead of staying with his crew, Stefansson walked off the ship onto the frozen sea. He said he was going to hunt caribou. He never came back. 11 men died waiting for a rescue that Stefansson did not organize, on ice that Stefansson had walked away from, serving an expedition that Stefansson would later claim was a success. And here is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about what happened on the Karluk. When the ship finally sank, the crew rescued their cat, a black tabby named Nigeriak. The cat outlived several of the men. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this channel covers historical expeditions, survival disasters, and forgotten true stories. The ones where human decisions, not nature, determined who lived and who died. The ice doesn't kill people. Choices do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.